Well, good evening, everybody. Here we go. Dean Allen's Frontierland. We've talked about this for long enough, but what a privilege it is to be here in Gino Spot's Centre Stage Studios in Port Elizabeth. It's something I've been really looking forward to doing. So thank you, wherever you're joining us from. I'm sure we've got people all around the world, but certainly here in the Eastern Cape, in South Africa, and perhaps in my home country of the United Kingdom as well. So wherever you're watching from, thank you for joining us, whether you're watching us live or this is a recording, because I promise you tonight we've got one hell of a show. This is something we've been talking about for quite a while now. As some of you know, and those of you who don't know my story, I know I just sound like I've got off the plane from the UK, but I've lived in South Africa now since the 1990s. I feel South African. I'm afraid to say, and I'm sorry to my English friends out there, that I even supported the Springboks against England in 2019. This is my home now, this is the home of my family, and especially here in Port Elizabeth, which is a special part of South Africa. The Eastern Cape has so much history and heritage, and that's the reason why I've decided to bring you this show called Frontierland, which is part of the Gino Spot stable. Some of you may have watched my interview with that wonderful man, Gino Fabry. He's an incredible talent, of course, but we felt there was a need to perhaps bring my style of presentation to the stable, which means that I can bring in people that I'm interviewing as part of the current project I'm involved in. I was brought here to the Eastern Cape by a man named Adrian Gardner, who's commissioned me to write a book about the history of conservation here in the Eastern Cape, which is a big project in itself. But I'm interviewing the most amazing people as part of that journey. One of those guys you're going to meet tonight, an incredible raconteur, a big man in terms of his personality, in terms of his stature as well. So I'm delighted to introduce Div in a moment. But I hope you're going to join me in the weeks to come, because I'm going to be bringing in a variety of guests along to Frontierland. And that decided to call it Frontierland because that's where we live. We live at the frontier here in South Africa and here in the Eastern Cape. But the most magnificent thing about this part of the country is we are really living its history. People have the most incredible stories. So it's not going to be just about conservation. It's not just going to be about history. I've been inspired by some of the people I've met along the way. So I hope you're going to enjoy Frontierland in the weeks and the months to come. So I'm going to bring on my guests now. I'd love you to interact with us, by the way. But before we go any further, of course, you can see behind, we've got to acknowledge some of the wonderful sponsors we have, none other than SPA, that sponsor and support the work here at Centre Stage. People like Amobia, they're the internet provider. Been provided by wonderful food from a lovely lady called Grace at Fat Cats. I mean, don't feel sorry for us doing this. I mean, we do it because of the food and the drink, which is wonderful. Fitch and Leeds as well support this program. So thank you for our supporters. Anybody out there that would like to get involved, please get in touch. But let's get this show on the road. I'm going to bring on none other than Div De Villiers. So enjoy.
Ooh, welcome to the show. Now it's your time to shine. We're going to have a lekker chat tonight. Another good time.
Cheers, Div. How are you doing?
Hey, cheers. Lekker, Dean. Nice to be here, and really honoured to be the first guest of Frontierland.
You are. It's making a debut. I mean, you're making a debut, of course, and I couldn't think of anyone better than Div to do that. But you're probably wondering why we've built this show, The Big Protector. So let's get that out the way. Just to stand here, give us a show of your great stature. Now have a look at this. There's not many people I look up to in the world, but what are you, 6'5"?
6'5", yeah, 6'5", still growing.
Well, you've got a while to go. You're a bit of a tiddler, obviously, there. 6'5" and size 15 shoes, I believe.
Yeah, the most important part of it is, I can't even lift my leg that high, but there we go. Size 15s.
As we're going to find out, you are obviously involved in law enforcement and things like that. I mean, it's a wonder why we've got any problem with law enforcement in this part of the country, because if I saw you coming, I'd certainly run the other way. Now, we've had a wonderful day today together. We spent our time chatting, getting to know each other, and I'm looking forward to this. And I think you're in for a treat, ladies and gentlemen, because this man is a raconteur of note. I mean, some of the stories, serious stories, but also very funny. And I think the work you're involved in, there has to be a sense of humour as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's serious work. Sometimes it's, you get very despondent in what you do, especially in law enforcement. So you've got to find the funny moments out of it. You've got to get that camaraderie, and fortunately we've got that in spades. We've got it in chunklers, good characters, good people of the Eastern Cape. That's why you're here. That's why you decided to settle here. And it helps, definitely helps to have a sense of humour and have characters around. Have a bit of fun as well.
I think as South Africans we've got to have a sense of humour. I mean, my perspective is always, the grass isn't necessarily greener on the other side, which it isn't. And here in the Eastern Cape, I mean, we're living real lives, and you're at the frontier of what you do. Let's sort of almost go back to the beginning. I mean, you're known as the big protector. You're a green scorpion, which is an interesting term. We'll talk about that more. Were you always born to conserve? Was nature always part of your journey, did you think?
I think it was, I think from a very early age, certainly from a school-going age, in the just late sort of 1960s, I went to a little school in Johannesburg, in fact, in what the suburbs are now, Rissidale. But at that time, it was plots. There were large open spaces around Cresta and Rissidale and Darrenwood. And I had a headmistress by the name of Jane Fraser, little old lady, very small, purple hairdo, but she was passionate about birds and about environment. So from that early age on already, we were being exposed as scholars to what conservation is all about. We were being taken on field trips, not only to the Darrenwood Dam, we're all marching down in our lines through to the Darrenwood Dam to go and look at the birds, but also to places like Kruger National Park, which she organised trips. I mean, that was way before her time. I don't know of any other school, certainly at that stage, and certainly in South Africa, that was punting nature conservation. So that's where the penny dropped. That's where the whole thing started. The passion was ignited, and so it just grew throughout my life.
But you've got a real colourful story, Div. I mean, you were thrust into military service in your teenage years, and I know you. But for people that don't know you, I mean, you embraced that. I mean, it was obviously a big challenge for you. I mean, you found yourself in on the front line as a 17, 18-year-old, I believe. And what kind of things did that teach you? Yeah,
look, 17 years old, obviously thousands of us went through military conscription in those late 1970s, 1980s. And I went in there with an open mind to just get through those 2 years and do the best that I could. It's in my nature to do the best that I can at everything I do. So going into military service, I didn't want to sit and be a jam stealer, as people used to put it. I didn't want to be a clerk somewhere. No disrespect to clerks in it, but that's not my nature. I wanted to get out there, and anything that was provided, I wanted to do. So I ended up, going on officer's course at Oudtshoorn. I did mine lifting and demolitions. I got a demolition certificate. I did parachuting. I eventually went to the 31 Battalion, which was the Bushman Battalion, and I spent over a year with the Bushmen, and that was a life-changing experience because I lived through apartheid years. My childhood and the school that I was in, there weren't black kids at all in those schools in those days. And for me to then be thrust into a Bushman Battalion and actually to become a company commander of a whole lot of Bushmen, it was mind-boggling. Besides the fact that they were wonderful little people, they showed me a lot about the bush, so working through the Capri and working into Angola and all of that was a complete life-changing experience. Something completely different to my days in Rissidale and I just, when I finished with the border, because I was on the border for about 14 months or something. When I finished there, I came back to South Africa, or the States as we used to call it. I just knew I can't go back to Johannesburg. I've got to go back into the bush. I want to look after nature. I want to look after what I had been experiencing for that time period. So so that's when I registered for Rhodes University to do a Bachelor of Science at Rhodes University.
And I heard you were one of the best scholars at Rhodes, weren't you? I mean, it was a wonderful career as a student.
I think so. I think if you look into my history, and you may well find that I was one of the top students in 1983. They asked me to leave after 3 months.
3 months?
Yeah, 3 months.
You lasted for 3 months?
Lasted for 3 months, but unfortunately then the Vice-Chancellor said he was had enough of me.
And
obviously too brilliant.
Obviously you were too good. Tell me why you chose Rhodes again?
Well, it was far away from Johannesburg. It offered a BSc. I was very keen on the marine life and fishing, so it had an ichthyology. It still has a very good ichthyology department. So the plan was to go through their play rugby, Quite easy to get into the Rhodes rugby side because they were flipping useless. So, I mean, I could walk like into the Rhodes rugby side. And lots of drinking, and the big draw card was that women were 6-1.
6-1.
6-1. So even an ugly bloke had a good chance of scoring at the university.
Yeah.
So that was the final.
And let me see, is that 6-1 ratio the reason why you lasted 3 months?
I think it was partly. All of the above.
But I learned today you were quite creative in the science lab, weren't you?
Yeah, I tried to mix quite a few chemicals at one stage. I didn't have a lab coat on, and there was quite an explosion. So the acid burns are still all over my body.
You got a badge of honour.
I did, and the Prof Brown, he was the professor there, and Prof Rivet, they tried to extinguish and stop the burning. And all. I had a rugby match on the weekend as well. Against the Shimlers. No, it was. We were too useless to play the Shimlers. We had to play the second string.
Yeah.
But of course, acid burns and that didn't go too well with the rugby.
Oh my goodness! And then that led you to inadvertently. It was a rugby. Wasn't it a rugby colleague that suggested maybe you needed to get outside again?
Yeah. So, hooker played a great part in my life. Dusty Gardner.
Okay.
He was the hooker in our rugby side, obviously. And when I was asked to leave Rhodes University, I was busy with an internal court case, and he came running to the Daily Dispatch, our local newspaper, and he said, "Hey, Div, didn't you want to be a game ranger?" I said, yeah, but there's like stuff all chance now, Dusty. He said, no, look in this newspaper here, there are 11 posts that are available right here in Grahamstown. And I didn't realize that Grahamstown was the regional office for the Eastern Cape. We were all Cape Nature Conservation at that stage, because it was a Cape province. And I looked at the advert, and immediately I ran through to where the offices were, Quarter of Hill and African in Grahamstown. But I still had this holy T-shirt on because it had been burnt from the acid explosion. I was barefoot, I had a big beard, I had no hair on my head because I thought I'd look quite mean for the rugby side. And I arrived at the offices, and a lady at the switchboard by the name of Lane Waters said to me, I must run up and go and have an interview with Bedford Edwards. And I said, oh, man, I can't, look at me, I'm not dressed for an interview. And she said, you're fine. She said, you are huge and you're going to be a great law enforcement officer. That's exactly what they're looking for. So I ran up the stairs, and there Bedford Edwards in his neat uniform, tie, epaulets, there were Bonterbox on the epaulets at that stage, and he interviewed me. And very, very interesting interview, very different to anything that we will do today, which I won't elaborate on even on this show.
I'm going to get there soon.
But I got the job, and so... yeah, sometimes life throws you curveballs in it, and it's one of those curveballs that I had, and it got me into conservation a lot faster than what I thought I was doing.
Isn't that amazing how one door shuts, another one opens? I mean, it's happened with me recently, of course. The Eastern Cape came calling, and here I am, and to connect with people like you, it's just an absolute privilege and honour. To be writing the story of conservation as I am, it's a big job. It's a big job. There are a lot of personalities, there are a lot of agendas, of course, and there's a history to bring up to date. But talking about history, your experiences in those early days of conservation, how were they different from perhaps where you are today? I mean, were you let to get on it more of your own initiative? I mean, how was this kind of idea of conservation managed back in the day?
Yeah, you're 100% right. The interviews in those days were pretty much, I think, a gut feel. Also from the supervisors that interviewed you. So they would look at what sort of passion you had, what were your hobbies. So like I said, I enjoyed fishing, and I enjoyed trapping dussies and things like that in the areas of honeydew, usually unsuccessfully. But anyway, those are the things that I would tell the person that was doing the interview. And for many years, that was the way that we did our interviews. I know that the Natal Park Sport of years of yore, the same thing. Colonel Vincent would interview people about their hobbies, if they collected birds' eggs or went hunting and fishing, or were some sort of naturalist, collect butterflies, then they got extra points. And then you were put out into the bush and virtually left on your own. Yeah. If you made trouble, well, then you got chastised, you got disciplined, you got kicked out virtually the next day. That was a very successful model, I believe. I think even today I would like to interview people who are who've been herds boys throughout their life. People that have had a passion for the wild and have been out there working with animals, even if they were hunters as youngsters. That's the way you learn about the wild. That's the way you learn about nature and felt. So to me, that was a crucial part, a different part today, where now qualifications and pieces of paper and degrees and diplomas and all that make such a, yes, they're important, but the greatest importance for anyone who's going to be a good conservationist is heart, it's passion.
Yeah, I mean, anyone watching, you can sense Div's passion. But your passion is for this part of Southern Africa, isn't it? I mean, there's something special about the Eastern Cape. You love the wild coast, you love the Transkei, that's your area, that's your region. What makes it so special?
The Eastern Cape is just completely different to anywhere else that I've ever been. So it's just got so many different biomes, so many felt types. It's so rich in species of wildlife. It's so rich in marine life. It's beautiful. It's got amazingly colourful people. The Amaxhosa, the Amampondo, the people of the Eastern Cape are, it's just difficult to describe. You just fall in love with it, and I just, for 40 years now, I've been trying to look after that amazing province, the environment and the people, because ultimately conservation is for people. Yeah. So you're quite right. The Wild Coast is particularly important to me, and then the Maluti-Drakensberg. I was involved with the Maluti-Drakensberg Trans-Frontier project from its inception, myself and Albert and Finyana for the Eastern Cape, and what an amazing project that was as well. Again, and they were different people, so they're dealing with the Basotho up in those areas, and of course our settlers that arrived in the Eastern Cape, great characters, and all Boet and Swaar and talking slowly, and the Afrikaners, the Boers that were in the area. What a mix of cultures! What an absolute example for South Africa of what a rainbow nation really should be.
Oh no, it's amazing, and hence the title of this show. I mean, Frontierland. We're at the frontier. I feel like every day I'm discovering new stories, new characters, different influences, and I have to tread very, very carefully. I'm an outsider, and it will take me a long time to be accepted, perhaps. But I think people appreciate my passion for the place. I feel like I've fallen in love with South Africa again, like I did when I first arrived in the mid-1990s. But you have perhaps a difficult role. I think at heart you're a ranger. You're somebody out there who wants to be there to appreciate nature and to perhaps grow and nurture. But how did this role in law enforcement come about, and how did you adapt to it?
Right, as I said, I started out in law enforcement. It wasn't very long that I was in law enforcement when I was sent off in those early days to experience different facets of conservation. That was also very nice in those years, is that you could go and do fisheries management, and then you did that move on to do reserve management, then you did a bit of research, then you did environmental education. I was testing professional hunters for about 5 or 6 years in my early days as a conservator, and learned a hell of a lot, because that exposes you to the hunting fraternity, and they know a lot about the bush.
Yeah.
So those were magic years. And then I went through to work in the former Transkei, as you say. I was based in Kokstad, which is just below close to the Drakensberg, and I worked there supposed to only go there for 3 years, but I worked there for 11 years.
Wow.
So my kids were pretty young, but when they were finished with their schooling, the primary schooling, they were going to have to go to a boarding school probably, and I thought it would be a good idea to spend the last few years of my kids' life with me, and I wanted to be with my kids. I love kids. And so there was a job advertised in my own department in law enforcement to basically establish a law enforcement unit, a compliance and enforcement unit. It was based in Bishu, which is the head office, which was not first prize. Bishu, I didn't want to go to Bishu. But looking at the establishing of such a unit and the potential that the contribution I could make to conservation there were very high priorities to me, and as well as the fact that my kids would be with me for another 5 years at least. So I applied for it. Now, you must understand, with affirmative action, with the whole history of the country, I didn't think I had much of a chance, my history as well. I'm open with my history. I was open right from the very first interview about the fact, that I was in the military. I was a captain in the infantry, and I was peppered with questions by the interviewing panels. But I think the people appreciated the honesty in that as well. And I was honest again. I was honest when I went to the interviews for this post, and I got the job. So in October 2007, I moved to Bishu, and I basically established what is now known as the Green Scorpions of the Eastern Cape. So it's the enforcement unit that deals with environmental enforcement.
Okay.
So 15 years I've been busy with obviously established a team, mainly ex-policemen, and pretty much we tried to get the best of the best, so that we could run with cases and we would have success. And it's been a wonderful success story. It's been a great model, and the team has been fantastic. So that's how I got into law enforcement.
And the name Green Scorpions, a lot of people watching would have heard that name. I mean, it's catchy, it's got a tag. We know of our scorpions here in South Africa, catching the bad guys. How did that name come about?
Yeah, apparently that name came about by the former minister, Martinus van Schalkwyk, being asked about the new unit that was going to enforce environmental legislation, the National Environmental Management Act, and various other specific environmental management acts that are associated with the NEMA, like the Biodiversity Act and the Protected Areas Act, Air Quality Act, all those things. So there had to be specialist investigators trained to enforce this national legislation. And they had a very long-winded name, certainly not a very sexy name. It was the department's name, and following the department's name would come environmental management inspectors. And Van Schalkwyk was talking to a whole lot of reporters, and they wanted to know what the name of these people were. And he came up with a brainwave there that they'd be called the Green Scorpions, because at that stage, the Scorpions were the elite National Prosecuting Authority specialists, the Director of Public, the DPCR, the Hawks, or another Hawks.
Yeah.
So the elite unit of investigations of organized crime and so forth. And he just thought, well, that's a good name, the Scorpions. So let's call these guys the Green Scorpions. And the name stuck.
Oh,
so now we're Green Scorpions.
Less time to sign off those dockets and things, I suppose. I mean, it's a catchy name. It's all about the publicity. We'll talk about that coming up. I mean, you have to advertise what you're doing. There has to be an awareness of what you're doing. And I think a lot of people are aware of perhaps, one of the main concerns in this part of the region, which is anti-rhino poaching. It's probably your flagship cause. We talked about that during the day, and it's a very emotive issue. Rhinos are I had the privilege only a few weeks ago out at Founders Lodge here to go on a rhino experience. I wrote a piece in the Herald only this week, and I've never given an injection to anything in my life, and there I am standing over a sedated 2-ton female rhino called Margaret, and the vet said, "Would you like to administer a syringe full of vitamins?" What the heck? But I tell you what, there was something about that experience, the majesty, the power of that beautiful creature. And I think, of anything, the plight of the rhino is probably what creates most attention. And I'd like you to talk about that for a moment, because I'm not going to tempt fate, but here in the Eastern Cape we seem to have less of a tragic story than perhaps in other parts of South Africa. Why has that been, and is it because of people like yourself?
Let's start with the rhino. It certainly isn't the only problem that we have, and in the Eastern Cape, touchwood, as you say, it's not one of our greatest conservation problems, but it is a massive problem. But the thing about the rhino, in my opinion, there are two things. One is that it's an amazing, successful conservation story. Now, we all like successful stories. We all like happy endings. And the project that Ian Player drove to bring back rhino into the country when they were on the brink of extinction in the 50s was just 50s and 60s was fantastic. Everyone knows about it. And so to bring back the white and the black rhino, those are the two rhinos that we could turn in South Africa, from the brink of extinction was just fantastic. Everyone was raving about it. And there's always been some poaching of rhino, because there's always been this demand in the East for rhino horn, and not as an aphrodisiac as other people believe, but as a pain and fever remedy. So there was poaching up north. We'd never had poaching in the Eastern Cape. So while our numbers grew, and we've got mainly black rhino here in the Eastern Cape, while our numbers grew, there were other areas, other provinces in the country that were losing rhinos, particularly from about 2006, 2007, there was a spike in poaching for the East. And there are various reasons that have been given for that. But we were expected it to start in the Eastern Cape at some stage, because we saw rhino horns being stolen from game farms. There were even hits on museums. I mean, there were people that were held up with AK-47s at the Amatola Museum, for example, and tied up, and then the rhino poachers lassoed the trophies off the walls to get the horns. And even though we had intelligence before the time, people just thought this was a joke. You know, they didn't think that anything's going to happen. And then in 2008, December 2008, I was having a braai at my house, burning some meat and having a beer, and around about 8:30 I got a phone call from Jaap Pinaar, who was my second in charge at the time and heading up operations for the Green Scorpions. And all he said to me, I remember the words were in Afrikaans though, but he said, "Rhino down, rhinocer plat." That's all he said. And I said, oh, I can't say what I said, but but I was, okay, Jaap, where did it happen? And he said it happened at Shamwari. Now, Shamwari is one of the Eastern Cape's prime tourism destinations, safari destinations, an amazing private game reserve. And it was about 3 hours drive from where my house was. So I basically said to Jaap, we've got to get out there as quickly as possible. We've got a bit of music going on. Okay.
That was Gino in the airways then.
Gino waving at us.
Gary, I think we've got images of this, what we're talking about now, Shamwari. If we can just put up the first couple of images there. Now this before we go any further, and I'm apologies for people at home who are eating their supper, but I think we need to remind ourselves of the barbarity of this pursuit. I mean, this is a victim of obviously rhino poaching. You can see this poor animal, it's had its horns removed. There's no care taken, its mutilated body. But the next image we can look at now, this is actually the Shamwari animal, isn't it?
That's actually the Shamwari animal. So that was the first rhino poaching incident in the Eastern Cape, December 2008. We went out the following morning, because obviously in the evening you can't do a crime scene like that, and Shamwari's got lions and all sorts of predators and that, which would be around the carcass. Yeah. So Jaap and I arrived at Shamwari as soon as the sun rose. We left early in the morning, like 3 o'clock, got there as the sun was rising, and there we saw this rhino lying. The first dead rhino that I'd seen, first poached rhino that I'd seen. Now it's a magnificent beast when it's alive. As you said, you see this animal. I've seen people crying when rhino have been captured and moved, the latest method where they sling them from a helicopter and they move them. And I've seen grown men just crying out of awe. And you must know, you arrive at a scene like that and you see this dead beast lying there, and this poor animal had been shot with AK-47, so it had been peppered with AK-47 rounds. I can't really describe the feeling other than it was really sobering, and you can even just see the guys walking around the carcass over there. The feeling that everyone has, it's a feeling of loss.
Is that a feeling you ever get used to?
I don't think you ever get used to that feeling, but you sort of you divorce yourself from that feeling in a way. You desensitize yourself. I think it's similar to what doctors do, and similar to what policemen do that investigate murders and so forth. You're never going to get over it. Some of those crime scenes, the animals have been horribly mutilated, and it's a terrible thing to see.
So how did that discovery of that on our doorstep here in the Eastern Cape? I mean, it was a problem that was happening elsewhere, of course. How did that shift the emphasis on your daily routine?
Well, immediately we started strategizing. We knew that there's going to be an onslaught on the Eastern Cape. There are now syndicates operating in the Eastern Cape. And that is where one of our big success stories comes in. We created a team which exists to this day of the various role players, the various enforcement agencies and top investigators. I mean, we've got like really good investigators currently from the Stock Theft and Endangered Species Unit. I mean, they drive most of the investigations now. But we had the Hawks, we've got Sand Parks, the South African National Parks, the East Cape Parks and Tourism Agency. We've got them all on board and we strategize. There's a lot of intelligence gathering. So the aim obviously is to first catch these guys before they even kill a rhino. And we've done that successfully as a team for a number of years now. So touch wood, and it keeps on going that way. We lost rhino. We had a huge syndicate that was using M99 tranquilizers to dart rhino. Obviously, it was a simple method for them because it's quiet. They overdosed the rhino. The rhino lies there. It's still alive while it's alive, but it's quiet. They saw the horn off. The rhino bleeds to death most of the time. Horrific, just horrific. And they were caught and they were prosecuted. There was a massive drive of public outcry. I remember then MEC Maboyane and myself and a whole lot of officials marching down the streets of Grahamstown. Thousands of people in the, and I was toy-toying in the front there, and eventually the MEC said, no, you can't toy-toy. Hey, just stop toy, just walk normally. You're not very good at this thing.
Yeah,
but anyway, we did that, and the judgment was, and the sentencing was awesome, because they got, effectively, they got life imprisonment. And that was the 3 involvers that were responsible for that. Advocate Bux Coetzee, excellent state prosecutor, and he was the driving force over there to get that case sorted out, as he has been for many of our other rhino cases.
It's a difficult question, but I just want to focus on the men that do this. It's probably an obvious statement, but aren't they the lowest of the food chain in terms of who's benefiting from that? They're taking the greatest risk. Who are they, and what drives them to do this, apart from the obvious, which is the money that it could bring in?
Yeah, I think that's the obvious. It's the guys that are doing the poaching are in it for the money. It's pretty lucrative. I'm not going to go into rands and cents and dollars and whatever what they make, but it's certainly a lot more than what they'll make in most other professions, and they do it very quickly. It's risky. Obviously, any organised crime is risky. Perhaps it's not as risky as some of the other crimes that we have, like cash in transit, robberies, those sorts of things. But it's driven by greed. Sure. And that's the bottom line. That's why this type of poaching takes place. It's not, some poaching is for subsistence purposes. Some things is to feed a family. There are many other ways that you can feed a family besides going and shooting rhino. It's just a horrific crime.
We were talking earlier. I mean, obviously you're there to enforce the law and to prevent this happening. But do you agree that education is the key in changing a mindset throughout this chain of crime? There has to be a demand for this product, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, law enforcement is a stopgap measure to just curb the onslaught against rhino. But ultimately, it's got to be a multi-pronged approach and education being key. So if you want to stop rhino poaching and secure rhinos for the future, we can continue. We've got to continue doing law enforcement. There's no two ways about it. I mean, there are people in the world that are saying we've militarized conservation, and there's a reason why there's a militarization of conservation for when you're dealing with a crime like the rhino poaching. But we've got to, as quickly as possible, get the message out there that rhino horn doesn't work. There are other alternatives to cure hangovers and headaches and so forth. And that the rhino deserves to keep its horn.
Of course it does. Undoubtedly. I mean, it's a magnificent animal to be close to, that's for sure. And what a privilege. Now, the rhino is one of the flagship species. If you ask anybody about poaching or conservation, rhino would be at the top of the discussion. One of the big 5, of course, and we're proud to have them here in the Eastern Cape. But you also protect other species. Tell us about the cycad, the little-known cycad, and the problem we're having in people removing some of our more rarer species of plant, for example. I mean, tell us about that.
Yeah, a lot of people forget that there are numerous other threats to the environment, and smuggling of plants and clearing of vast areas of valley thicket in the Eastern Cape for crops. Those are all aspects that we deal with as well. So unlawful clearing of sometimes thousands of hectares of thicket. It's an Eastern Cape veld type. It occurs here in our province and has numerous species. But then also the smuggling of species of succulents in particular, and then the cycads, which you mentioned. So cycads are prehistoric plants. They were around in the age of the dinosaurs, very slow growing plants. There you can see a photograph of some cycads on the back of a bucky. I'll get to that story now. But there's a big demand for cycads that come out of the veld, out of the natural habitat, particularly by landscapers, and particularly up in the Gauteng area, Johannesburg and so forth. They're sought after. It's a bit of a status symbol, pretty much like having the newest Mercedes-Benz in your garage. And people don't really care where these cycads come from. They can't get them necessarily from nurseries because they take too long to grow. And if they grow in a nursery, they'll grow in a very sort of nice manner, even drunk. So if you can get out of the veld, porcupines have eaten at it and gnawed at it. They've developed curves. They've been burnt by fires, veld fires. So and they're big.
Yeah.
You know, you could some plants that are 4 meters, 5 meters in size, and you know, depending on the species, those can be several thousand rand per inch or a couple of centimeters. So it's lucrative for everyone involved in that chain of poaching. Right from the beginning, the guys that are taking it out, maybe not so lucrative for them because some of them I know get paid pittance, but certainly then the transporters and finally the men that are selling it or the ladies that are selling it at the end of the chain.
I just want to go back to that picture, if I may, Gary, because I don't know, you look very European in this picture.
Yeah, so
is there the reason behind this?
So one of the ways that you get to bust a syndicate or to get hold of someone that's involved in the trade in species is to go undercover, and that was one of the occasions that I was undercover. In fact, it was during the World Cup time, so it was just 1995, if I remember correctly, that was taken. And no, that would have been later. But anyway, it was one of the World Cups.
Was it the Soccer World Cup?
Yeah, it was the Soccer World Cup. It was probably 2010. Yeah. So I was a Frenchman undercover in that particular photograph that you're showing me there.
You've got the perfect moustache, haven't you? Let's face it.
And I moved into that community. Luckily, I know quite a bit about soccer, which was nice. I had and I just wanted to see this French tourist coming out there to see cycads and to see the wildlife and that of the Eastern Cape, and I had a particular passion for cycads. So I was in the community and I said, oui, the cycads, you know, and the horrible French accent, and the only thing I could say was cycads and soccer. And then the guys came to me with some of the French soccer players' names, and luckily I knew a few of them. So anyway, and we busted it. So at the end of the day, we brought that syndicate down, and our special investigation unit in the Eastern Cape has had major successes with the cycad poaching. So much so that at one stage we had 42 people in jail here in the Eastern Cape. And they had prison sentences from 7 years to 11 years. And cycad poaching after that dropped to, well, I can actually say dropped to zero. Wow. We had no incidents reported as to cycad poaching while the guys were in jail. Unfortunately, recently there was an amnesty, and a lot of people were granted amnesty and were released from prison. A lot of those were cycad poachers. And they're back to their ways. So we're back in the veld again and trying to apprehend perhaps the same poachers that we previously caught, which is, you know, it makes the investigators very despondent, obviously, and of course the prosecutors that have put hours and hours into the prosecution start all over again.
One of the names that you've mentioned, I've had the honour to actually interview him as part of my book study, is a gentleman called Jaap Pienaar. Jaap is one of those incredible men. He's now in his 70s, and a lot of his time he gives voluntarily for this cause. But I think one of my favourite stories that you recounted involved Jaap, and it involved a cycad. And it's that dilemma between duty and family and a sense of honour. Just relay that for us, will you? One Christmas it happened.
Yeah, it happened one Christmas when Jaap was still staying in the Koberga area, what is then known as Port Elizabeth. He'd been working throughout the December time period, as we usually do, and he had a meeting that he'd attended in Overston, which is way up in the Free State border. He was coming home, looking forward to Christmas dinner with his family, his wife and his kids, and driving his Ford Cortina, and looking forward to home. He's getting pretty close to Port Elizabeth, going through the Alexandria area, and suddenly an oncoming vehicle is coming at him, and he sort of checks it out, and he sees, but this thing's got a cycad tied to its roof. And he looks again, and, you know, this is one of the ways that cycads get transported. They get tied, they're heavy plants, and the spiky leaves get put down, they get tied up with rope. And this cycad has been tied with rope, and it's passing him. And now he's thinking of Christmas dinner and drinks there at home, and he sees the vehicle just pass him, and he's, oh, damn, I've got to do it. That's just one of those things. And his broadie's there, and he's changing gears, and he slaps the blue light on his roof, and he tells the story usually mixed in Afrikaans and English, so it's actually quite classic. But anyway, he's racing after this vehicle, and he's catching, but he's convinced the vehicle's actually trying to get away from him, and he's flashing, and eventually this vehicle stops, and he jumps out. And he's a burly guy, and he sort of starts running towards the vehicle. He's angry now. This vehicle's messed up his Christmas lunch and everything. And as he gets closer, he sees, but at the back, there's two kids, and their eyes are bigger than saucers. He says, "Soos pierings," he says. And the lady in the front seat, he sees, is like seriously anxious. And the guy that gets out is nervous as heck. And he's about to like really give this guy hell when he notices that the plant is actually not a cycad. It's one of those plastic Christmas trees that looks like cycad, and it's all tied up. And this guy's white in the face, and Jaap's in uniform, and the guy says, "What did I do wrong?" And Jaap says, "No, you did nothing wrong. Just want to say, my name is Jaap Pinaar. I'm from Nature Conservation, and I just want to wish you and your family a happy Christmas." Shook his hand. Cheers, bye.
Brilliant, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. That poor family probably telling the tale to this. Why did he start?
Yeah, no, wonderful nature conservators. So
thinking on his feet,
and such happy people racing off to wish you a Merry Christmas.
No, as you said, you've got to work with a sense of humour, and I can imagine you are doing that. If there are anyone watching this, if you know Div or myself, and you'd like to add some questions, please do. This is your chance. I know a lot of Div's friends are watching in from East London and beyond. If you've got any nice stories that you would like to share, or I'm sure, keep them clean, please, because I'm sure that Div's had a colourful life. We can see one here, Camilla Ellis. What is your take on cattle in urban areas? They're so beautiful. I regularly herd them down my street because they eat plastic out of our dirt bags. An interesting one. I never thought of that, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really to do with environmental affairs, but I'll tell you one thing I can tell you about cattle. Is a well-managed cattle and game farm is an asset to the Eastern Cape province. Very early on in my career, it was said to me that cattle and game, so there was the late Dr. Eddie Young wrote a book about game farming, and Botma wrote a book about game farming. And everyone advised that when game farmers start out, they should have cattle and game. Cattle being the bulk grazers, the purpose, pretty much the same purpose as what buffalo have. And so that's something that I'd like to just share about cattle. The other thing that I'd like to share about cattle is the importance of cattle in the former homeland areas, the Amaxhosa and the Amampondo.
Okay.
Cattle is the center of their culture. So what you may be seeing in some of the urban areas is that cattle are coming from areas where Amaxhosa and maybe Amampondo and some of the other, some of the other black people have moved in, and with their culture and the importance of cattle, perhaps that's one of the reasons why they're coming to an area. And they are beautiful, but they can also, obviously people get upset when they eat their garden plants and stuff like that. There'll be municipal bylaws.
Even here in Port Elizabeth, you're driving through Quebec, you're driving through, and you're constantly reminded we're in Africa, because I think that's an amazing part of it. Is it because they're allowed to roam in common areas? Is that part of the remit? Do people see a common area, albeit a road lay-by or something, and it's fair game?
Yeah, I really don't know that answer. I can only put it down to the fact that it's, the people that have moved into urban areas, and cattle is a really crucial part of their culture. So any research that I've done in the former Transkei area, along the Wild Coast, in the Drakensberg, people have such an affinity towards cattle. There's such a love for cattle. And I think that comes with them when they come through to the urban areas as well. Now
we're on the subject of animals that perhaps don't cover your area of influence. Remind us of an experience you had with a rare being, which is someone bigger than you, on a trip to Rwanda, I believe. And that kind of changed your perspective on nature in many respects.
It probably did. There was a trip to Uganda.
Uganda.
Yeah,
sorry.
And I'd been invited by the university, Stellenbosch University. A lot of people may know Dave Peppler. He was he's quite a well-known radio and television personality, and he was part of the team, myself and various researchers, and there was a chap by the name of Mark Newman. Mark Newman was doing a documentary of the whole thing. So we were going to look at various forests in the Ugandan area, do a comparison between the Uganda people and parks and the South African model, and then also just look at the gorillas in Burundi, which was an amazing experience to be a part of. So fortunately for me, again, at the time I didn't think it was fortunate, but my new camera that I bought at a very reputable camera company in East London, humbugged from the very first day in Kampala. And I couldn't get the thing to work. So I didn't have a camera that was with me. So I ended up being the tripod carrier for Mark all over the show. Carrying his tripod with me, I actually got credited in the documentary then, the tripod carrier. Yeah, no. And we got to see the gorillas in Bwendi. So before we went into the forest, the guides took a look at me and they came up to me and they said, right, sir, you are very big. There may be a problem. If the silverback comes down, if we should be in the forest and we see the silverback and he comes down, he may be intimidated or he may come at you to inspect you, investigate. If it happens, just look down. Like, be submissive. Don't stare at him. So I thought nothing further of it really, and we went into the forest, and not long after, maybe half an hour, we came across the gorillas. They were all in the trees, and there was this beautiful, beautiful silverback. I mean. And it wasn't long, and he came down the tree and turned, and he just immediately looked at me.
He picked you out.
He picked me straight away. His eyes went straight into my face like that, and the guy that was with me said, look down. So I looked down. They're like, trying to peep because, this is the only chance probably in my life I'm going to see these animals. And he came probably within 5 meters of me. He came very close to me, and I sort of managed to sort of glance at peep like that, and he hit his chest just a couple of times. And then he sort of turned around, and he popped his head into his massive hand. I mean, his hand is twice the size of my hand. And he sort of rustig, peaceful, just sat there, and then he barked an order. And all the gorillas came down out of the trees, little ones and everything. And then he was chill for the rest of the time. Mark rolled, the cameras rolled, and some great footage. But just the discipline that he had there as well. I remember a little gorilla fighting with his brother or sister or whatever it was over some termites that they'd found. And he just barks an order at them, and end of story.
Amazing.
I'm the boss of this windy forest. De Villiers, you've got no place here, but.
Isn't it amazing how he picked out the other alpha male, the big guy he needed to stake his claim?
That's nature
is amazing, and we're part of nature. You can see those similarities in some of the people we know in our lives, of course. I mean, it's all about just staking your claim and just saying who's boss. Yeah. And there was another story we shared over dinner last night, the story of that incredible jackal that made its way home. I mean, these kind of incredible stories of nature. What was that?
Yeah, well, I was reserve manager of the Umtiza Nature Reserve, which is outside East London. It's about 20 kilometers outside East London. That was in the 1990s. And a lot of people have the habit of catching small animals and keeping them as pets, wild animals. It's certainly not something that is, we don't actually allow. It's against the law.
Yeah.
And we certainly don't condone it, but it happens, and some of these animals actually make quite nice pets, especially when they're small. One thinks of monkeys, but usually at the end of the day, these things grow up, and then people want to get rid of them. And there was a case of a black-backed jackal, and a young boy had been given this jackal pup from, obviously, when it was very small. But he stayed in Cambridge, which is a suburb right slap bang in the middle of East London. And the mother phoned me one day and said that this jackal has now got too big. Its name's Dusty, and it lies on the boy's bed at the bottom of his bed, but it's just like chewing things up, and it's fighting with everything, and neighbours don't want it, and they've got to release it. Now, it's not policy just to release an animal, certainly these days, but in those days we made a plan. I said to her, bring the jackal, we'll release it here. It's not really a forest animal, but at that stage there was quite a lot of open area around the Umtiza Nature Reserve, the forests. There were grasslands and so forth as well. So we released the animal there. Now, as I said, it's at least 20 kilometers from Cambridge. It wasn't 2 nights. I think it was the very next night. It may have been 2 nights later. But this jackal got back to Cambridge and jumped through the window of the house and went and lay at the foot of the bed of the little boy. So the mother phoned me again and said, hey, Dusty's back. I said, geez, that's impossible. No, he's back. I said, how can he find his way back? I mean, he didn't walk here. He drove me out of the car. He's never been in his life before, and he's back so quickly. Yeah, he's back. So we made another plan. We said, okay, bring Dusty. We'll take it to another reserve, which is a further 20 kilometers. So it's more than 40 kilometers from Cambridge. It's going through informal settlements. It's going through farmlands. It's going across a dam, and it's going all the way through to Fort Pater Nature Reserve. So there we released Dusty again and thought, okay, Dusty will now lead a happy life forever. It was probably 2 weeks later. If I go back in my diary, I'll probably find exactly how long it was. But it was quite a substantial time. I got a phone call again from the same mother. You won't believe it, Dusty's back. Dusty jumped through the window, onto the bed again, lying with my son. I said, man, can't you keep the thing? We'll make a plan. No, we cannot keep this. Jackal has got to go. So unfortunately, Dusty ended up in the East London Zoo, and he saw out his days in a zoo, pacing up and down. I went and saw him a couple of times, pacing up and down the fence line. It's a nice story, but it's also a horrible story. It paints a picture of what happens when you have wildlife as pets. And as I said, we certainly don't condone it. It's against the law in South Africa. You cannot have wildlife as a pet without a permit.
But
it
just shows the incredible intellect, the instinct of wildlife, isn't it?
Absolutely amazing.
No, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, another thing we got in common, apart from our love of the Eastern Cape and the outdoors and things like that, is I didn't realise you're a big soccer man. Now, I'm not going to ask who you support because I don't want to upset people on the viewing this at the moment. But perhaps I am going to upset a few people because, as people would know, recently I went back to Europe and I went home to England for the first time in 3 years. And one of the privileges I had was a visit to one of the iconic sports stadiums in the world. And I've got some footage from that, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that now, Div. Hello, it's Dean Allen here, and I'm at probably one of the most famous football grounds in the world. This is Anfield, the home of Liverpool FC, who've played here since 1892. I'm going to take you on a tour of the ground today. Behind me you can see the wonderful pitch and the building work that's going on, because they're going to increase the capacity of this stadium in the coming months. So we'll follow that journey, no doubt, but join me for the tour. Now, I'm not the star striker or the manager, but this is where the guys do the media after the game, so you probably recognise this setup. All the sponsors, big money at this level, of course. And here I am, sat in a famous seat, none other than Mo Salah here. We're in the Liverpool FC changing room. As you can see, there's not many change rooms in the world with leather seats. All the comfort for these guys. Fantastic place. So here we are, we're pitch side at Anfield, and behind me is probably one of the most famous stands in world football. That is known as the Kop, and it's a South African connection because it's named after a battle during the Boer War, and that was Spienkop, that was fought back in 1900, in January of that year. In fact, many men from Liverpool fought in that battle, and that's why the club have named their famous stand after that famous incident in South Africa. But I also like coming back here because in that very goal there, back in 1994, a man named Brian Tinian scored the winning goal in the FA Cup, which knocked Liverpool out of the cup that season, and he plays for my team, Bristol City, so we must mention that. And I'm going to finish the tour of Anfield today here at this most poignant spot. This is a memorial to those that lost their lives at Hillsborough in 1989, those Liverpool fans who went to a football match and never came home. So this is quite a poignant area, obviously for all Liverpool supporters, but football supporters around the world. Well, you can see, I mean, I certainly enjoyed my trip back to Liverpool and the United Kingdom. You can hear probably my voice is a lot better than it was in that video. The other thing, I don't know, Div, you know about Liverpool. Well, they're famous for the Beatles, of course, but they know how to have a good night out. And a few of my friends from England decided it was time for a belated stag do. So as you can see, that was the morning after the night before, hence my voice wasn't very good. But what an honour to be able to tour around a stadium that's iconic. I know we've got a lot of Liverpool supporters here in South Africa. But did you know that history about the stand with Spienkop during the Anglo-Boer War?
I did, and I've been to Spienkop a number of times. Being a member of the Game Rangers Association of Africa, we pre-COVID had a lot of, every year we toured national parks, nature reserves and so forth across South Africa and Africa, and we've been to Spienkop on a number of occasions. So yeah, I visited the grave sites, and I'd like to encourage people to just explore our country like that. It's got an amazing history.
But I think people, when we travel, when we do road trips throughout South Africa, to have that knowledge as well. I mean, even my little Frontierland book, I mean, it's not an in-depth history, but just to have it in your bag. Lovely. So you go through these little dorps, and they've all got a story, haven't they?
They have, and you tell it so well. I mean, the books that you've you've given me to read. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I mean that. I'm not just saying that. It's just written in such a nice, easy flow manner, and picking out those really important parts, interesting parts about the little towns. So
yeah, I think you can inundate people with information, and it's the punchy stuff. And also, I mean, if I can say that your books, you relate. I mean, there's a couple of, you've got a book called The Poacher, for example, and you divide it up into the stories. Some of you've experienced, I can see you've added a little bit of salt and spice to it, so it made it a little bit more entertaining. But I mean, it's part of your legacy, isn't it? To share these experiences. I mean, I hate to think, Div, that you are going to sail off into the sunset and just leave all this knowledge behind.
As you know, I'm drinking whiskey over here. This is not ginger ale.
There's nothing.
So,
cheers, by the way.
I enjoy having a drink with mates. I enjoy having a drink around the fireside, and I enjoy telling fireside tales. And it's part of being a game ranger is that camaraderie, as I've mentioned time and time again tonight. And around the fire, you reminisce a lot with your mates about these characters and about stories. And people always say, we should write these things down here, and they never do it. Now, there's so much that's written about game rangers and that of the Kruger National Park and up north, and so there's so little written about the guys of the Eastern Cape. And as you've been saying, this is this frontier. It's a wild frontier. It still is, and it's got all these characters. You can't lose those stories. So I put pen to paper as best as I could. And that book's actually been a marvelous success. It's fourth print, and it's all sold out again. So maybe it'll have to go through a fifth one.
No.
But it's just putting those stories out there of the characters of the Eastern Cape and of this fantastic environment that we have.
You mentioned your involvement with local communities here. I mean, that's how their history is passed down. It's through oral. It's through stories. It's telling the next generation how it was. Mm-hmm. How important is that? And is that something we're losing perhaps in modern generations? Do you think?
I've always been a storyteller, and it just sort of comes naturally. But some of the best storytellers are the black people of South Africa. So I've obviously listened to a lot of stories from the amaXhosa, but the Zulus, as Ian Player was always saying, they have this amazing ability to tell stories, and I think we are losing it. But there are more and more people that are trying to bring it back. So there are story festivals and trying to bring out the importance of culture of the indigenous people of South Africa. And I think that's very important. So conservation shouldn't just be about the conservation of our plants and our animals. Sure, that's important, critically important, but it's also culture and history.
Of course it is. We've got a mention here from Rambotha. Hi Div, can you tell your viewers about the spike in other environmental issues, I presume due to COVID-19, such as the province-wide problem of, what's that?
Taxi hunts.
Taxi hunts. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that's come through there. So a taxi hunt is hunting with dogs. Now, hunting with dogs has become a huge problem in South Africa. Look, hunting with dogs is an age-old tradition, it's, especially with young boys. And the problem with it, with the spike in illegal hunting that's taking place currently, and as Mr. Boyta is saying, especially after the COVID and during the COVID time period, is that a lot of it is not for subsistence hunting. It's not even boys having that sport, which is in any case illegal, but it is for gambling. So the taxi hunt is where taxis are hired to take greyhounds and various specialist hunting dogs to areas where there's a lot of game, and then betting takes place on these dogs nationwide. So there are a number of Facebook groups, gambling groups and so forth that bet on which dog is going to be the first one to take down an animal. It's completely indiscriminate hunting. They don't go for any specific target. It needn't be a springbok. It could be an extremely rare animal. It could be, quite often we see that aardvark have been taken down. And as I say, all sorts of animals, birds even, anything that the dog can get hold of gets torn apart, and then the money changes hands. That's a taxi hunt. During COVID, as soon as the roads opened and people were allowed to move around again, there were a lot of people that were bored. So there was a spike in illegal hunting. not only in taxi hunts, all sorts of other hunting as well, but particularly with dogs. And it's still a problem. We're trying to address it. Again, education is important, awareness is important, but law enforcement is key to the whole thing as well. Now, there is a place for, I believe, for hunting in South Africa, in Africa. I mean, it's been an important part of the culture of Africans virtually forever.
Yeah.
Conservation, I believe, is wise use of your natural resources, but you've got to use it so that they are sustainably used for present and future generations. That, in fact, is a definition of conservation. And hunting is one means of using your natural resources. Obviously, one wants to do it in an ethical manner and a legal manner. But the debate around whether dogs should be used for hunting is one that can go on for a long time around a fire. There's provision made for it. If you have a permit, or if you hunt on a farm where you've got the landowner's written permission, and that farm has got a fence around it that adequately encloses the game that the farmer is looking after, and one of the management tools may be that form of hunting. Perhaps you'll have a hunt with people coming in with dogs, controlled manner once or twice a year. But the uncontrolled and illegal hunting with dogs is a massive problem. It's wiping out a lot of our wildlife.
We've had this conversation before, obviously, when I've interviewed for my book. Hunting itself has had a significant role in the evolution of conservation in the Eastern Cape. Can you explain how that came about? The Adequate Enclosure Act was significant, wasn't it, back in the 70s, I believe?
Yeah, so the Provincial Ordinance 19 of 1974, in fact, which is still applicable, it's still our legislation that we use in the Eastern Cape, makes provision to allow people to manage the game on the land. Now, remember, when I started in the 80s, there were hardly game farms around in the early 80s in the Eastern Cape. There was very little game. People didn't want game on their property because they'd rather have sheep and goats and so forth. So when the game farming industry started taking off, more and more people wanted to put game onto their farm to attract hunters, to attract tourists. And in some areas of the Eastern Cape, there's far more game now than what there was in the 1970s and 1980s because of the desire for farmers to look after their veld and to look after the game that they've put onto their veld. It's been a model that's not only been used in South Africa, it's been used in other countries of Africa. But people benefit out of the wildlife, and that's important. You can't, some areas you can't just have ecotourism, photographics and so forth. You just, it's not, the attraction isn't there for someone that's taking photographs. That may be marginal, that may be very difficult to get to. But hunters get to those areas, and if it's sustainably done, if it's well managed, then it's definitely a tool in the conservationists' arsenal of tools to look after the veld.
Okay. It's a very sensitive issue. I know a lot of people have got different views on that, but I've got to acknowledge that because it is significant in terms of shaping our landscape, putting a value on the head of certain animals as well. And we've seen through the use of, as I said, regulated hunting, that certain species have actually flourished as a result.
Yeah, I mean, rhinos is actually a case in point. It's a horrible example to use, but I mean, it was put out there. Eventually, people were legally hunting rhino on farms. At the stage, let's talk about some of the other species that were on the brink of extinction, and hunting brought them back. The grey roebuck in the Eastern Cape is a prime example. So fowl roebuck, as some people will know it, wasn't sought after for its meat like the rooi roebuck or the mountain reedbuck. In fact, farmers used to shoot them, as they say in Afrikaans, voor die voet. As soon as they see a fowl roebuck, they'll shoot it. Until such time as the East Cape Game Managers Association put that as a prime trophy animal. Now, a lot of people are very anti-trophy hunting, but it really saved the grey roebuck from extinction. Similarly, bontebok, again, they become a very valuable species, and people wanted to hunt bontebok to have it as a trophy. Now, I'm not a trophy hunter, but I recognize that there's an argument that can be made for trophy hunting, and it certainly has had a role in conservation of a number of species in the Eastern Cape and across South Africa, across Africa, in fact.
It's an incredible learning curve for me. I mean, I've come into this as an outsider with a very limited knowledge of conservation, albeit I come from a come from a background in the West Country of England where we have the debate over hunting with hounds, and that's still going on. You can talk about heritage, culture, history, because it goes back centuries. Whole communities survive because of the pursuit of hunting, and it's something I'm going to have to navigate very carefully, but you've helped me do that so far, and I appreciate that. I think we've got some more images here of some of the significant people that have... before we go to the images, I see there's a couple that have come through here. Hey Div, great to hear more of your stories of life. Oh, isn't it just? I mean, what a privilege. In the trenches, certainly on the trenches. On a more separate note, what do you think of, what's that say?
Extralimitals.
Extralimitals in the Eastern Cape. I'm learning new lingo here.
Yeah, so thanks, Alistair, for that.
Thank you, Alistair.
Again, you guys are throwing questions over here that we should be debating deep into the night around a fire with a lot of beer, because the answers are so difficult, and there's so many different opinions. So extralimitals are alien species to the Eastern Cape.
Okay.
So you've got some animals that only occurred historically, we believe, in the Eastern Cape. There's a great amount of research by Skeed, for example, that shows what the historical incidence of mammals are in the Eastern Cape, and it's pretty accurate. It's based on all sorts of research and the diaries of hunters and explorers and missionaries and farmers and paintings in caves of the Bushmen or the San and so forth. And they don't believe that giraffe, for example, occurred in the Eastern Cape. Now, a number of game farms in the Eastern Cape have giraffe on. They have impala. Impala also didn't occur in the Eastern Cape. But they've done exceptionally well. Now, I don't think, in my personal opinion, I don't think that we should have giraffe and impala and these extralimitals that we know were not from the Eastern Cape in our national parks and in our provincial nature reserves. Because there we want to bring back and we want to show the Eastern Cape as it was. But I think where you've got an economic incentive, where you've got a game farm or a farm that's trying to make a living, I don't see that that's a bad thing. I personally don't see that that's any different to whether the person is farming with sheep or goats. So he or she being the landowner, being the farmer, bringing in giraffes and bringing in impalas and all sorts of other things. I personally actually prefer to see them on the farm and to see goats and boerebokke eating all the spekworm and the thicket and all that type of thing. I'd rather see our indigenous animals, because they're indigenous to South Africa. So there I must make a distinction as well. If they're indigenous to South Africa, perhaps they would have moved over the years. We put fences in the way, we blocked their routes. Perhaps they would have moved, and they may just, there's been such a kudu migration over the years, even in my time, in the 40 years that I've been around. There are areas that have never had kudu, and kudu have moved through corridors and they've got to areas.
Okay.
Interestingly, the former Transkei, there's no records of kudu, ever, or rhino. So there's strange questions even around what is extralimital, what is alien to the Eastern Cape and what isn't, and would they have eventually arrived? So my point is, if it's from South Africa, and giraffe and impala are, then I'm not completely anti it. If it's now, if it's something that comes from overseas, fallow deer, red deer, that type of thing, mouflon, Barbary sheep, those sorts of things, I don't want to see them on our farms. That's just my opinion. I don't think that they, especially if they can get out and become a problem in the area, and I think there can be damage felt and so forth as well. But that's my personal opinion. We could, again, as I said to Alistair there, we can argue that one around a dry fire.
Yeah, I mean, part of where I'm going to start the book is that you're looking at the study by the likes of Skeed. Skeed makes claim of these are the original animals here. Now, one of the buzzwords, of course, is rewilding. It gets bandied around. From a purist point of view, if we're going to rewild the landscape, shouldn't we just bring those indigenous species back? But as Alistair said, there is a debate around animals like giraffe. But I think you've answered that. But it is, again, another sensitive issue, isn't it? Because we are remanaging or managing the environment now. You look at the work that they've done at Shamwari, for example. I mean, you can physically see this is agricultural land that is recovering in front of our eyes. What species we put in, isn't that man influencing it in a different way? I mean, how far do we go to manage that?
Yeah, and I mean, a place like Shamwari, we spoke with Adrian Gardner last night, and he was talking about when he released giraffe onto Shamwari many years ago. obviously it's a tourism draw card too. So whoever's managing that game reserve, let's not call it a nature reserve then, or private game reserve or game farm, decides through veld management and so forth, can I bring these animals in? Are they going to survive? If I've only got grassland, I can't bring a giraffe in. That happened at Mkambati, by the way. They did such poor assessments of what they should bring in. They brought in giraffes into an area that's mainly grasslands. I mean, the giraffes, the only way they could eat was by leopard crawling. You know, and eventually, obviously, they died, and there were mass graves of all these species that should never have been there. But, you know, a farmer's not going to do that because he's going to lose financially.
Of course he is.
And eventually the veld's going to be trashed anyway. So all that gets taken into consideration in at the end of the day through a management plan.
Yeah, okay. Can we bring those pictures up? Oh, what the question, sorry. Thank you, Rudolph. Very kind of you. Nice to see you online as well. Please mention sand mining along the rivers and the sea in residential areas along the coast.
Yeah.
So another environmental issue here.
Yeah, one of the big environmental issues in the Eastern Cape, and I believe in KwaZulu-Natal as well, is unlawful sand mining. It is just rampant, especially on the Wild Coast.
Okay.
You're sitting with probably about 250 unlawful sand mines on the Wild Coast. Now, the Wild Coast is iconic. It's this one area that everyone talks about in the Eastern Cape. You've got features such as Hole in the Wall near Coffee Bay. It's famous. You know, the only other thing in South Africa that's apparently more famous than Hole in the Wall is Table Mountain. And yet, we are allowing the Wild Coast to be stripped in front of our eyes. There are more than 250 illegal sand mines along a 280 kilometre stretch of coastline. That's nearly one illegal sand mine per kilometre. And trucks are going in there daily. In some places, literally dozens of trucks per day. Not paying taxes, not permitted, and carrying away tons and tons and tons of sand. Unfortunately, I didn't see who sent that question through, but unfortunately, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy are responsible for that part of environmental law enforcement under the National Environmental Management Act. We do assist in the back many years ago. It was part of our mandate, and we had quite a lot of success in at least in getting cases to court and in fining people. It wasn't as rampant as what it is now. Unfortunately, DMRE are very stretched with manpower, and there's illegal mining going on all over the country, not only sand mining. So they have their hands full. I don't know what government is going to do about the unlawful sand mining, but it's got a huge knock-on effect on the economy of the country. Negative effect, I must say, not a positive effect by any means. And they're basically, there's a whole lot of mafia that are running the illegal sand mining along our coastline.
If anybody's got any specific questions they'd like to take off air to Div, please contact the show afterwards and we'll put you in contact. I know Rudolph Hillerman there had a specific issue with that, so please do get in touch. I mean, only earlier today in one of our talks, you even offered out your cell phone, which I won't do live on air tonight because this will go on the internet, but I know Div's very open to fielding any inquiries like that, so thanks very much. But I just want to go to those pictures, Gary. Please let me go if you don't mind. I want to see these pictures because for me, this is interesting. Isn't this the first time that you appeared in the press? Because what is the role of media when it comes to this? I mean, it looks like a long time ago.
Yeah, no, look, I'm far more handsome now than when I was there.
Oh,
Clearly.
come on.
Look at that. Yeah, that was I think 1983 or something like that. So we were working in our December holidays, and as I mentioned earlier on, that's expected of nature conservation officers or environmentalists, especially in law enforcement, is you've got to work through your Christmas holidays. That's the time when people come down and do all sorts of naughty things. And
apart from Yap Pienaar, of course, when he's rushing home. Yeah.
And there I'm working with some honorary officers. Besides, Cecil was my partner there on the left side of the photograph, Cecil Molotano. And that in itself is very interesting, is because just the relationship that we built up in the 80s with our black conservation partners. That was like working together in the veld. Ian Player often spoke about it and the importance, and that's when you realize, hey guys, we're all equal.
Yeah.
We're mates, you know, we look after each other. I had to once or twice smuggle one of my colleagues into campsites that wouldn't allow blacks into campsites, and I would put him under some blankets and put the tent up myself, sneak him in, make sure that there was no one in the bathroom when I got him out there. But I'm going off on a little bit, diverging a little bit from what I wanted to say about the honorary officers here. And the honorary nature conservation officers are volunteers. So they volunteer their time. They don't charge the department or government for their time. And there's provision made for it in the legislation that you can appoint honorary nature conservation officers or volunteers. And they've been immensely useful to us over the years, as South African National Parks, as the various parks boards, and as the Department of Conservation or Environmental Affairs. Right in the beginning, when Cape Nature Conservation formed in 1952, that's when the honorary officers started. There were 500 of them, and eventually 500 under Dr. Douglas Hay, working all throughout the Cape Province and volunteering their services. Some of them are specialists. So, for example, in the Eastern Cape, we've got a specialist group of honorary officers, attorneys, pilots, people that know how to fly drones, that have got drone licenses, medics, and all sorts of people that want to give their time, to conservation, make a contribution to society, and to ensure that we've got a clean, healthy and safe environment.
The volunteer sector, of course, is important in a lot of initiatives, but especially in conservation. We were talking earlier about the strain you're under in terms of budget constraints, not just in conservation, in a lot of areas, of course, in public life here in South Africa. Where do you see the future? Do you see more private enterprise getting involved? I mean, we'd hate to lose the likes of you from service because of budget constraints.
Yeah, look, it's a reality. Budget constraints, and there just isn't money. You get told every year that budgets are going to be cut, and they're going to be cut more. And unfortunately, environment isn't a priority. A priority that's right up there with education and health and policing and security and so forth. We're pretty much further down, far down on the food chain when money gets handed out. And we really do get a pittance. It's very, very difficult to perform the mandate that we're expected to perform as officials. I mean, law enforcement requires vehicles. It requires sufficient money to get from A to B. We're a massive province. And it's just impossible to do everything when there's a massive onslaught, especially in the economic climate that we're in. People that are hungry, poverty, people that are doing crime, sometimes to get food on the table. But you've got to get there. The law says this is what, this is what has to be done, and the law must be complied with. So with budgets getting smaller, even for the biodiversity conservation, even for protected area management, what's going to happen into the future? I believe that there's got to be partnerships. It's happening in other sectors of government, security, health, etc., etc. From a conservation perspective, we're going to have more and more of the private sector and businesses and non-government organizations, non-profit organizations assisting with conservation in the Eastern Cape and in South Africa. They're already doing it. It's got a lot. There's a lot more of that happening than when I started in the 80s. The non-government organizations of those years, I remember the Wildlife Society was the big one, and probably one of the only ones. Maybe WWF, I think, was around at the time, but they weren't as big as what they are now. And WWF, the Wildlife Foundation of Africa. No, it's late at night now.
The Wilderness
Foundation.
Wilderness Foundation. How can we forget a wonderful organisation?
So Andrew Muir and that's the organisation that Ian Play established. So the Wilderness Foundation have assisted us hugely over the years as well. Another NGO that's just so important to us, and throughout this whole rhino war, and that they've just been helping. I think that the future, those types of organisations become more and more important. As I say, the government's always going to be there. There's always going to be that oversight. There's always legislation that has to be enforced. There's always the stamps for permits and that have to be that have to take place. But the money that comes in, I think that's going to come from business, private sector, philanthropists, so forth. That I believe is going to be the future for conservation in South Africa.
I'm sure most people listening, I know myself, we've donated to these charitable causes. We think we're helping the rhino. We think we're helping these endangered species. What is your advice to people that can make best use of their funds and their time? How can we help? Because there is a lot of corruption out there, isn't there?
Yeah, and the case in point was when the rhino started falling and people started establishing these non-profit organizations and fundraising organizations to help the rhino, and they started selling things like rulers and fancy little booklets and raffle tickets, and at one stage there were well over 400 of these fundraising organizations that popped up, and they were raising money for anti-rhino poaching in the Eastern Cape. I can tell you now from being right there that there were only 3 organizations that actually gave us some money in the Eastern Cape.
3
that I'm aware of.
3
that gave us sufficient and meaningful contributions to the rhino conservation at that time.
Incredible.
And Wilderness Foundation was one of them.
Yeah, of course.
So what I'm saying now is that people that have money, and there are quite a lot of people that want to donate. I told you a story earlier on about when I went on a wine walk in Wellington, for example, and there's this guy that was, I don't know how he ended up there on this wine walk in Wellington with all these wealthy people walking and drinking wines from one estate to another. It was lovely.
Did you get away with it?
I think I got away with it. I think they thought I was wealthy as well. But anyway, one of the guys, a youngster, he came to me and he said, I've only got two passions in life, and that is like my real passions in life: wine and birding. And obviously his little hikes, and while he was hiking, he was drinking wine and looking at birds and so forth. But he says, I make a hell of a lot of money, and I won't tell you who he is and what he does in it, but he says, I want to give my money to conservation causes, but I don't know who to give to. So I said, well, geez, who are you giving to? No, well, he's giving to, and he mentioned BirdLife Africa. I said, well, that is a reputable organization. So keep on, my mate. That's a good one. But if you're ever in doubt, give me a call, or make sure that you are giving money to a reputable non-government organization. Nice. Because there's so many that people that haven't done that research, and they thought, well, they're giving their salaries, and kids were getting a whole year's worth of pocket money and giving it to someone that's going to go and steal his money. That was just ridiculous.
So do your background checks.
Do background checks. Make sure that it's a reputable, honest, non-profit organization or NGO that you're going to give your money to.
Gary, there's a couple of pictures here I want to put up in terms of some rather important people you've met. This is African royalty, I believe.
Yeah, so this is the late king of the Amaxhosa, and the reason why this picture is here is just to show that as a conservator, you've got to meet and greet and be able to talk to everyone.
Yeah.
Whether it is a pauper or whether it's a king, you're going to be able to sell conservation and the message of conservation to whoever. And sometimes you'll be influential people. Sometimes maybe at that particular point that you're selling conservation, you don't think it's such an influential person. He or she may well become influential in later years, and hopefully they'll think back then and say, the message dropped on that particular day. That conservation is important, and I believe that conservation is not only about being in the bush and looking after animals and plants. Yes, that's the fun part of it to a lot of us, and that's why I went into it in the first place, because that's where I wanted to be. But over the years, I've learned the importance of politics, the importance of mixing with people that have influence, the importance of mixing with school groups, and the whole education thing behind it. People are key to conservation.
Yeah, and you've seen some great examples of leadership out there. I believe the next picture up here, this is a gentleman that's really given you great assistance in your work.
Yeah. I wonder if he's actually watching.
I hope so. I hope you're out there.
I think everyone knows who that is, and he's pretty much a hero to a lot of people. And that's our former MEC, Jonas. Great leader, a man of integrity, as we all know. And I worked with him for many years. It was through him that we established the Special Investigation Unit in the Eastern Cape, which has had so much success. And we've had a number of really good MECs in the Eastern Cape that I've worked with over the years who've been supportive. We're a department that's linked with economic development as well as environmental affairs. Sometimes it's a difficult marriage. You've got economic development, you've got environmental affairs. Now you want to develop the economy of the Eastern Cape, and you also want to look after the environment. And sometimes those two don't really sit in the same bed. Okay. You're also vying for funds and so forth. But where you've got strong leadership, and where you've got I think back to Smuts and Gonyama, he was a fantastic MEC as well. Knew us all by name. Would call us in, discuss things, find out our opinion about certain conservation projects. Korangwana, another one on the Wild Coast. He wanted to know what was going on. I had to organize some helicopters, and he jumped in a helicopter with me, and we flew up and down the Wild Coast. I showed him the problems on the Wild Coast. In Sekeni, when we got it declared as a Ramsar site, Korangwana was in a helicopter, or we went to Sekeni to check the area. Those are key moments that I can think back of really inspirational leaders, wonderful people who had the power to actually get something done in conservation. You need those people. You need that support. You need that backing, and they back the team. And the other person that I just want is before I forget, is the wonderful leader that I've worked under over the years, and the guy by the name of Albert Mfenyana. What a man that was. What a leader. To bring a team together and support us through anything. Backing us to the hill. It didn't matter what. If you make decisions for conservation and you come to him afterwards and you phone him at night, no matter what the time, he would answer the phone, he would discuss it with you, he would give his opinion. And he just brought the team together. Unfortunately, he retired a year or so ago, and has that position of general manager. He was the general manager or chief director of environmental affairs. The Eastern Cape won numerous awards and individuals in the Eastern Cape, and it's not about awards, but it's about the recognition that people just saw the conservation in the Eastern Cape leading the way and setting examples, as you mentioned earlier on, so many examples, precedent-setting examples that came out of the Eastern Cape. And he was the leader. Albert worked through the system, not a token appointment by any means. Magic, incredible man. I got the greatest respect for him, and what a team he built up. And it's all about teamwork and trust.
Of course it is. I can see the inspiration. You've inspired a lot of people, Div, and that's for sure. I mean, in my research, your name comes up time and time again, and I hope you're going to be around certainly in this province and in conservation. Just to wrap up, there are a few people I think we need to acknowledge back in the history. You've mentioned Dr. Ian Player a few times. Those of you watching this, Dr. Ian Player was certainly a part of the journey of Adrian Gardner. In terms of creating Shamwari and what he did. He was also very fundamental in setting up the Wilderness Foundation, the work of Andrew Moore that goes on today. Ian Player, perhaps a high-profile name in terms of conservation, but he put this cause on the map. Can you mention a little bit about Ian and also those of his contemporaries that were really the pioneers of changing a mindset of a generation, really? That's what it was about, wasn't it?
Look, the iconic conservationists of Africa, I mean, one thinks of Stevenson Hamilton, one thinks of Voluter, and then one thinks of Player as some of the iconic people of conservation over the years. I mentioned Albert Mfinyana as being a fantastic leader. Makubu Ntombela was another one that was Ian Player's partner. I mentioned earlier on the guys that were with me, Saxton and Zame Bobotyana. Such a great inspiration to me, such a great partner. A lot of people will say they knew Ian Player. It's great to say, oh, Ian Player was a friend of mine and so forth. Ian, I knew Ian, but I will never say that Ian was a friend of mine. I knew Ian pretty well, and I knew Ian's wife. The reason why I knew them was because I was friends with Jim Feely, and Jim Feely was Ian Player's best buddy, or certainly one of his best buddies. And Jim and I worked together in the former Transkei for many, many years. So when we went to functions of this logo that I've got on here, and this badge over here, that's the Game Ranger Association of Africa. It's one of the organizations that Player established. So when we went to these functions, Ian Player was there, and I would go into his, very, very often into his rondavel or his cabin where he was with Jim Feely, and we'd talk and we'd have drinks and drink tea, or in the evenings drink beers and what have you, and discuss conservation. So I knew Ian. He did the foreword very kindly to my book on Kambati and the Wild Coast, the one that John Costello and I brought out, and the first edition as well.
Show everyone that beautiful cover.
It's
a beautiful book.
Yeah, I remember that, I think we were at Letaba, if I remember correctly, but I remember in the lodge that Ian was at, and when I asked him to do the foreword, I produced the manuscript, and he looked at it and he said, "Shit, I didn't know this was such a big document that I've got to go through, but I'll gladly do the foreword for you." And then he turned to me and he said, as he paged through, he said, "But this is all very good, but this is not your story.
Not your story.
This is not your story. I want you to tell your story." And he put the thing down and he said, "You have had the privilege of leading an adventurous life that many people will aspire to. And people want to know that story." He said, "Go back and start writing your story. Stories of the Eastern Cape and stories of the experiences that you've had." Because obviously Ian had done all that as well. And so I did. I produced those things and I sent them through to Ian, and I sent them through to Jim Feely, and they commented on them and so forth. But what an inspirational guy, in the presence of Player. The first time I met Ian was at Mkuzi Game Reserve, and I was an aspiring member of the Game Ranger Association of Africa. And Ian was giving a talk to all the rangers. Now, at that stage, the GRA, as it's known, was 90% white. It was the 1990s, very few black members. He went and stood in front of the audience. There'd been a whole lot of rumblings about how poorly we paid, and I mean we were poorly paid in those, how poor the conditions are, the normal rumblings. Like in the evening, it was great. We'd have a lot of camaraderie and all that. But now, when the moaning session comes out, we can be good moaners as well.
Yeah.
And Ian stood up front there and he started talking about the game rangers of Africa, the black rangers of Africa. Man, what a speaker that guy was. It's very seldom that I've been brought to tears by someone that's talking passionately about anything. And he was talking about conservation, about the black rangers out there, the African rangers, and how they've been at their posts. How at Garamba, that some of them had been working for more than 2 years without uniforms. And he'd been to them and he'd spoken with them, and they're still at their posts, and guys are dying. Even now, rangers, when you show the photograph there of Liverpool, there are hundreds of field rangers in Africa that are losing their lives. Virunga mountains. And Ian was talking about these guys, and it was an amazing. And the few times that I saw him speaking at a public event, he just had this ability to just draw people and impart to that knowledge and that passion. It was absolutely unbelievable. And when he's finished with that, he didn't come and sit back in the audience with us whiteys. He walked outside, and there under the thorn trees were the black rangers that he hadn't seen for years and years and years. And he went there, they'd come from all over the show, not only in Kuzi. And he went and he sat under a thorn tree. And he spent the entire day speaking Zulu to people that were not in our audience.
Amazing. Yeah.
And there I learned a lesson as well. So, always talk to everyone. Don't walk into a meeting and only go and greet the high-flying officials who are there and sort of ignore the field ranger or the chef or the people that are serving you.
Yeah.
Those guys, maybe one day just whether or not they get to a point that they get in a point of authority one day. The point of the matter is they're people and they're important.
Yeah.
And the message of conservation is just as important to be imparted to those people as what it is, maybe even more important than what it is to get to the top person, the so-called top person at a particular function. So an important lesson, and what a man. Yeah. That's all I can say. He was just a real inspiration in all the things that he was doing for conservation.
By all accounts, people listen to Ian Players. People have listened to you today. I've been in your company now on several occasions, and today you've just enthralled people with your stories, with your humour, with your humility, your incredible experience. You're celebrating 40 years in this game now, Div. 40 years. So I tell you what,
quite a good batting average.
I know. You've got to get to your half century. I mean, those 3 months at Rhodes University didn't do you bad, did they? And the irony is, of course, you returned very recently to get a PhD, a doctorate. So, and congratulations on that. What's next for Div De Villiers? And we do not want to lose you from the Eastern Cape, and we certainly don't want to lose you from conservation. Where do you see your future? I mean, have you got many more years in your current role, for example?
No, I haven't got many more years in my current role. I think 40 is a good innings, but I don't want to leave conservation. I want to continue making a difference in the field. I think I can make a bigger difference out there now than what I can inside government. I would like to start working on projects. Look, I love the Eastern Cape, so that'll be my first choice if I can continue making a contribution here in the Eastern Cape. But any sort of conservation job, training is definitely going to be part of it. I'd like to impart with some of the knowledge and experience that I've built up over the years. So there will be some training. There will be maybe a few tours, taking a few people out to specific areas. I'd like to sit around the fire many more times with people that can make a difference. Maybe people that want to make a difference to the Eastern Cape and South Africa. I'd certainly like to have those opportunities. But who knows? Who knows where it's going to take me? I'm definitely not going to be a sports star anymore. I'm definitely not going to be a rock star. So.
Well, what was your saying today? You hope as many people turn up to who saw it the first time? What was that?
Yeah, this morning's breakfast. Yeah. I was a bit worried at one stage because we had a full hall of 150 people, and so my first target was just to break 5
Why
people.
5?
Because
Why 5?
When Supertramp, the rock band or the band Supertramp, when they had their first gig, or when they had their first concert, apparently only 5 people pitched up for that concert.
Well,
so I wanted to break that, and when I saw more than 5 people arrive this morning, I look great. I'm beaten that.
And for the record, there was far more than 5 people. We had a good 100 or so come to see us this morning. But no, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I hope people out there have enjoyed it. As you can see, I think we've set the bar high in terms of our first ever edition of Frontierland. You had to be my first guest. I mean, not only do you fill the screen in terms of your height and size, but in terms of your personality. You've got so much to share, Div, and for me, you encompass what's great about the Eastern Cape. Your humility, your experience, but you're making a difference here, and that's what I see so many people doing. So thank you for coming on. I think we can toast a good first show. I hope everybody out there has enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us. That's the main thing. If you'd like to follow up on anything we've talked about, just drop me a note in any of the socials. You can follow me on social media. Or get in touch with Div. I can put you in touch with the great man here, and let's hope we can get some good work done, which is the main thing. I want to wish everybody a good evening. Thank you, Div.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you for supporting our first show. We'll be back in 3 weeks' time. I've got an incredible lady called Francine Zana joining me, which will be fantastic. There she is there, and that will be on Thursday the 10th of November, again the same time, and from then on we're hoping to do this fortnightly. So thank you again. If you've enjoyed Frontierland, please share this program. It's available for recording on YouTube and Facebook and all the usual channels. But thank you, Div. Thank you, Gary, for your great help as usual. He's the man that makes this happen. Have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you again soon. All the best.